They called it justice. But in medieval Europe, justice didn't wear a blindfold. It wore iron, spikes, fire. It laughed as bones snapped, whispered through gags, and sang from inside brass bulls. This wasn't law. This was theater. A theater of pain, played out on wheels, in cages, underwater, and over fire. It didn't matter who you were. A thief, a heretic, a drunk. There was a punishment made just for you. Forget history class. This is the real story of the darkest, cruelest, most creatively horrific punishments ever devised. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Welcome to the worst punishments in medieval Europe. Before we dive headfirst into the iron jaws of history, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. It keeps the torches lit around here, and it means you won't miss the next descent into humanity's darkest hours. And while you're at it, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? What time is it right now? Are you lying in bed at 2 a.m., half asleep, and somehow deep in medieval torture lore? Or are you watching this on your lunch break, surrounded by coworkers who have no idea what's in your earbuds? Either way, welcome. You're in for something unforgettable. The pear of anguish. It was never meant to be an edible. No soft flesh, no sweetness, just cold, heavy iron. Crafted in the shape of a fruit, but designed with a cruel twist of mechanical imagination. The pear of anguish, its name sounds almost poetic. Until you find out where it goes. Let's say you were accused of heresy in 14th century France. Or maybe someone whispered that you consorted with demons. Or perhaps, worst of all, you were a woman suspected of being too vocal, too free, or too unchaste. The punishment wasn't death. Not immediately. It was the pear. Picture this. A small metallic device shaped like a bulbous fruit, divided into 4 segments, a screw at the top. When turned, the segments opened outward, like the petals of a blooming flower. Except these petals didn't hold beauty. They tore through mouths, rectums, or vaginas, wherever the device was inserted. Slowly, deliberately. The victim was usually restrained, not just for practical reasons, but as part of the theater, because medieval torture wasn't always about information. Often, it was about performance. The message was, look what happens when you defy the order. And if you think this device was reserved for spies or enemies of the crown, guess again. Gossiping women, homosexuals, alleged witches, even thieves, if the executioner felt imaginative. That's the part that hits hardest. The randomness, the unpredictability. The punishment was never about the crime, it was about power, about control, about spectacle. Because in a world lit by torches and governed by superstition, fear wasn't just a byproduct of punishment. It was the point. Let's zoom out for a second. Think about the hands that made this object. A blacksmith, probably commissioned by clergy or civic leaders. Someone who pounded iron into a pear-shaped vise with careful, deadly precision. There's a haunting intimacy in that craftsmanship, the way it fits in a hand, the way it blooms. Not just a tool of pain, but a message forged in metal. And then there's the silence, because when the pear was used, the victim couldn't scream not for long. The device, when used in the mouth, broke teeth and shattered jaws. It was designed to silence. To mutilate the very organs of speech. When inserted elsewhere, it destroyed tissues from the inside out. Internal bleeding was common. So was infection. And if someone survived, which, miraculously, some did, they were left broken in ways that were invisible to the eye but permanent to the body. There are no names carved into the side of a pear, no records of how many were used, no monuments to the victims. These devices were quietly removed from history, buried beneath the more cinematic legends of iron maidens and flaming bulls. But they existed. And they whispered something darker than death. They whispered that suffering could be engineered, made portable, repeatable. And perhaps that's the most terrifying thing about it. The pear wasn't a tool for execution, it was a tool for message delivery. A grotesque little letter opener for human defiance. Insert, turn, mutilate. Let the next would-be rebel imagine it happening to them. There's a reason it's remembered with a shiver. The pear of anguish didn't just hurt tit humiliated. It desecrated the private body in public. It turned orifices into battlegrounds. And it whispered to every onlooker, "You could be next." But as brutal as this device was, it wasn't the most dramatic. It wasn't the bloodiest. It wasn't even the most visually disturbing. Because while the pear worked in silence, the next punishment preferred sound. It liked bones. It liked breaks. It liked the wheel. The breaking wheel. It starts with the sound of wood, not the creak of a chair or the snap of a twig but the long, thunderous crack of a cartwheel slamming into bone. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was not invented for subtlety. It was punishment as performance, execution as choreography. And oh, what a spectacle it was. The condemned was dragged into the town square, already battered, already broken in spirit, sometimes half-naked, always bound. The crowd gathered, clergy, merchants, children on shoulder saw, waiting for the same thing, to see someone become less than human. At its core, the breaking wheel was a wooden cartwheel, a tool repurposed from transport to torment. Victims were tied spread eagle across it, limbs laced through the spokes like meat on a grill. Then came the executioner, armed with a hammer, a club, or sometimes just a thick iron bar, and then strike. Not once, not twice, but systematically. The blows were meant to shatter bones, ankles, shins, knees, arms, elbows, ribs, over and over, in a rhythmic display of calculated destruction. This wasn't about killing. This was about keeping them alive long enough to feel the full performance. The executioner would work from the extremities inward, careful not to hit anything vital at least, not yet. And after the breaking came the wheel itself. In some cases, the twisted body was threaded through the spokes limbs, snaking between wood like a grotesque loom. The entire contraption was then hoisted upright, displayed like a human windmill of suffering. Left to hang, left to die. Buzzards came next, or crows, or just time. It could take hours, sometimes days. Not death by trauma, death by thirst, by shock, by exposure, by humiliation. This punishment was popular throughout Europe, from Germany to France to the Low Countries. It was a crowd pleaser, if you can believe that. People wrote songs about it. Saints were martyred on it. And when it wasn't used on criminals, it was used on rebels, traitors, and anyone unlucky enough to get caught on the wrong side of a noble's wrath. There was even a legend behind its name. Saint Catherine of Alexandria condemned to die on the wheel, but according to hagiography, the wheel shattered when she touched it. A miracle, a refusal of pain. She was beheaded instead, which, in this particular context, almost seems merciful. But for the rest, there were no miracles. Just the crunch of cartilage, the squelch of muscle, the rising roar of a crowd eager for more. Here's the darkly ironic part. The wheel was sometimes seen as merciful. In certain executions, after all the bones were broken, the executioner would deliver a coup de gracia final blow to the chest or head. A mercy kill, a release. But that only came if the crowd approved, if the victim entertained well, if the pain had been sufficiently theatrical. Medieval justice wasn't always about proportion. Often it was about deterrence. The breaking wheel sent a very specific message. Defy us, and we will not just end your life. We will turn your body into a warning sign, a monument to what happens when you challenge power. Because that's what this was, at its core. Public punishment as a kind of sculpture, a kind of morbid architecture. A body, bent and broken, frozen in a final pose of agony, to be studied, feared, and remembered. No paintings survive of most victims. No statues, no tombstones, just rumors, chronicles. And the wheel itself recreated in museums, sterilized, stripped of blood and screams. But imagine standing there in the town square, the smell of sweat and rot, the sound of cheers as another leg snaps like dry wood. Imagine being the next in line. Because it wasn't always murderers and monsters. Sometimes it was poachers, protesters, thieves, or just people who knew something they shouldn't. And that's why the wheel was so terrifying, not just for what it did, but for how close any of us could have been to feeling it. But if you think the wheel was bad, wait until you hear about what they did with rats. Not cages, not bites, something much, much darker. Rat torture. At first, it looks like something out of a kitchen. A simple clay pot, maybe a metal bucket. Nothing about it screams horror, until you realize what's inside and what it's about to do. Rat torture was the kind of punishment that didn't rely on iron spikes or elaborate devices. It relied on one simple principle: animals will do anything to survive. And when trapped between fire and flesh, they choose flesh. The setup went like this. The victim was tied down, often shirtless or with the abdomen exposed. A pot or cage filled with live rats was placed upside down on their stomach. Then came the heat. Coals. Torches. Flames licked the back of the container, turning it into an oven. The rats, desperate to escape the growing inferno, dug down, through the only exit they had, into the body beneath. Claws, teeth, panic, a living drill, powered by survival instinct. The result wasn't just pain, it was chaos, internal bleeding, organs shredded, skin torn from the inside out, and it happened fast. Unlike the slow theatricality of the wheel or the mutilation of the pear, this was pure, primal horror fast, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Rat torture wasn't exclusive to one country or kingdom. There are records from the Tower of London, from the Dutch Revolt, even hints of it in Spanish Inquisitions, always done in the shadows, always whispered about. It wasn't a crowd pleaser. It wasn't even officially sanctioned most of the time. It was the punishment you got when someone wanted you to scream and disappear. And there's a reason it worked. Medieval society wasn't squeamish about blood, but rats? Rats were something else entirely. They symbolized disease, filth, decay. They were the enemy of clean society. So to be tortured by, own devoured from within by something so despised wasn't just pain, it was humiliation, dehumanization, turning a person into a carcass before they were even dead. But let's pause on that image. A rat clawing through a man's stomach, his body thrashing against the bindings, unable to stop the inevitable. That's not justice. That's not deterrence. That's theater for a very specific kind of audience, one that doesn't need a gavel, but a gasping sound. Not judgment, but a show. This kind of punishment wasn't about crime or guilt. It was about terrorism in the medieval sense of the word, instilling fear, sending a message, because after all, anyone can be imprisoned. But to be eaten alive by rats? That's a story that travels. That's a legend that lingers. The kind of thing that makes even hardened rebels think twice. The psychological edge was almost more effective than the physical. Just the threat of rat torture was often enough to break prisoners. Because when you know there's a creature under that pot-gnawing, frantic, waiting, it doesn't take long to confess, to invent, to beg. And what's worse, the rats always lived. When the victim Diodor passed out, the pot was lifted, and the rats would scurry away, red-mouthed, wide-eyed, having survived another night in the service of law and order. No executioner's blade, no fire, no gallows, just a borrowed stomach and a borrowed fear. It's tempting to think of this as fringe, as exceptional, as something so barbaric It barely qualifies as medieval. But it wasn't. Rat torture didn't need an empire. It didn't need doctrine. It only needed a corner, a bucket, and someone willing to wait. Which made it dangerous and frighteningly available. And if you think that's as low as it gets, if you think we've hit the floor of medieval punishment, remember, the darkest ideas aren't always improvised. Sometimes they're designed, engineered, measured in inches, steel, and leverage. Because there's a chair waiting, a special one, forged in iron, built not to hold you, but to hold you down. The iron chair. From a distance, it looks almost regal, high-backed, armrests, solid craftsmanship. It could be mistaken for a throne until you get close. Then you see the spikes, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, embedded in the seat, the arms, the back, even the footrest, each one sharp enough to pierce flesh, each one waiting. This was the iron chair. Used in various forms across medieval Europe, Germany, Italy, Francate, was a masterpiece of intimidation. The chair wasn't designed to kill. That would be too easy. It was designed to sit with you, to make pain last. The victim was placed carefully into the seat, not dropped, not slammed, placed with precision. Each movement, each adjustment drove another dozen spikes into their skin, and then came the straps. Iron bands, or leather buckles, used to bind the limbs and torso to the chair, tightened until movement was impossible, until the body was fused with the chair itself. But the spikes didn't go deep. That was the point. They punctured just enough to draw blood, enough to create a constant full-body sting. And once the victim was strapped in, the real show began. Sometimes they were interrogated like that. Other times they were simply displayed, left for hours, sometimes days, for public humiliation. The blood would congeal, the wounds would become infected. The body would stiffen from lack of circulation. It wasn't death. It was immobilized, suffering, a museum of agony, still alive. Some versions of the chair were even fitted with heating system skull trays beneath the seat that slowly turned the spikes red hot. That took things to a whole new level. Now, the victim wasn't just pierced. They were being cooked. Every breath baked their lungs. Every twitch deepened the burn. And the worst part? It didn't leave big dramatic wounds. No severed limbs, no pools of blood, just pinhole-ish hundreds of them oozing silently. It was pain by 1,000 needles, a slow drain of dignity. The iron chair wasn't for common thieves. It was for traitors, for witches, for people who needed to be made an example of, but sometimes, example just meant being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or making the wrong enemy, or refusing to confess fast enough. You didn't need to be guilty. You just needed to be seated. The psychological weight of the chair was almost as powerful as the physical. Think about it. A room, a dim torchlit room. In the center, a single object. A chair, waiting, silent, menacing. The threat of it was enough to make strong men weep, to make innocent men confess. It was the perfect punishment for a society obsessed with control. The chair didn't just restrain the body, it paralyzed resistance. You couldn't thrash, couldn't scream loud enough, couldn't even faint without waking up to a fresh layer of pain. And for the people watching, it was mesmerizing, grotesque, a spectacle of stillness. Unlike executions, which were over in a flash, the iron chair was long form. The pain played out slowly, publicly, intimately, because that's what this was really about. Not the crime, but the message. Not the justice, but the memory. People who saw it didn't forget. People who heard about it whispered the details. It was performance art in iron. And it didn't need much. No dramatic contraptions, no firestorms, just a chair, a victim, and time. But of course, some punishments didn't need even that. Some were simpler, cruder, quieter. For those, You didn't need a forge, you just needed a reputation, a mask, and a reason to make someone shut up. Because next comes the punishment made for talking too much, the one designed not just to silence, but to humiliate every word you ever said. The scold's bridle. In the grand hierarchy of medieval punishments, some were about pain, others about death. But this one was about shame. The scold's bridle, also called the brank, wasn't built to draw blood. It didn't break bones or roast flesh. What it did was something far more surgical. It cut straight to the soul, and it did it through silence. Here's how it worked. The device resembled a mask or helmet made entirely of iron, cold and clunky. It fit over the head like a cage, bars wrapped around the cheeks, the jaw, and most importantly, the mouth. Inside, a small metal plateau, sometimes a spike, was inserted into the victim's mouth, pressed flat against the tongue, or worse, pierced through it. It was locked in place. Now imagine trying to talk. Impossible. Every attempt to speak meant pain. Every movement of the tongue was punished. The message was brutally simple. You talk too much. Now you won't talk at all. The bridle was used almost exclusively on women. Women who gossiped. Women who argued. Women who shouted at their husbands, accused a priest, or simply refused to be quiet. The offense didn't need to be criminal, just loud. The bridle was society's response to female defiance. Not just a gag, but a muzzle. And it wasn't just worn in the dungeon. These masks were often used in public. The woman would be paraded through town wearing it, like a walking warning label. Sometimes a bell was attached to the top, ringing with every step, drawing attention. Children laughed. Adults pointed. Friends turned away. The punishment wasn't just silence, it was humiliation amplified. There were many versions. Some were simple cages. Others were works of cruel craftsmanship, with grotesque faces, devil horns, animal snouts, each designed to mock the wearer. And make no mistake, this was mockery disguised as justice. No one died from wearing the bridle, but in some ways, that made it worse. You didn't get the martyr's flame. You got a slow rot. The tongue would swell, the teeth would grind, infection set in. The iron would heat in the sun, freeze in the cold. You didn't die, but you remembered every second. And so did everyone else. Because like most medieval punishments, the bridle wasn't just about the person wearing it. It was about the people watching. It was a tool of memory, a symbol of social control. Keep your words in line, or this will be your new face. Sometimes the sentence lasted hours, sometimes days, and in rare, particularly vindictive cases, weeks. No eating, no drinking, just a humiliating wait for the privilege of taking it off. And what's terrifying is how effective it was. It didn't just punish, it reshaped behavior. It made women think twice before speaking out, made them hesitate before accusing, confronting, complaining. The mask stayed behind long after it was removed, etched in memory, lingering in gossip like a ghost. Because that's the thing. This punishment was gossip turned inward. The very thing it claimed to prevent public humiliation was its engine. It fed off the same energy it punished. In the dark theater of medieval justice, the scold's bridle was the quietest play. No screams, no fire. Just a clang of iron, a flick of shame, and the slow erasure of a voice. But while this punishment was personal, the next one was public, in a way few others were. If the bridle made you a laughingstock, the next punishment made you a human billboard, a living piece of street furniture. Because now, we're stepping into the stocks. The stocks. Let's set the scene. A small village square, cobblestones, a market stall selling onions, children playing with sticks, and in the center of it all, a wooden frame, weathered, creaky, unmistakable, the stocks. Two thick planks of timber with holes carved for ankle sore, sometimes wrists and necks, depending on the design. A simple hinge locks the wood in place, and once you're in, you stay in. There were no ropes, no nails, just wood and time. You didn't bleed in the stocks, not unless the crowd got creative. You didn't scream. There was no iron, no fire, no executioner with a title and a sword. The pain came from something far more primal: exposure. Because once you were locked in, you were no longer a person, you were a display. This wasn't hidden away in a dungeon. The whole point was public humiliation. Everyone saw you. The butcher, the priest, the people you owed money to. Children threw rotten vegetables. Dogs sniffed you. Strangers laughed. Friends pretended not to see. What was your crime? Could be anything. Stealing bread, lying, blasphemy, not attending church, sleeping with someone you shouldn't have, or just being in the wrong place when the constable was bored. The punishment wasn't in the pain, it was in the waiting. Hours, sometimes days, rain, Sunday, cold, no food, no water. If your limbs swelled up or your back spasmed, too bad. You couldn't move, couldn't stretch, couldn't scratch that itch crawling up your shoulder like a little demon whispering, "You did this to yourself." And the worst part? You were silent, trapped. Your only job was to take it. The stocks weren't meant to reform you. They were meant to reduce you, to shrink your pride down to the size of a whimper, to turn your body into an example for every villager with a bad idea and a spare moment. And make no mistake, this was entertainment. People came to watch, to jeer, to throw things, to make jokes. If you were unlucky, the local drunk would take a leak beside you. Or someone with a grudge would slap you across the face and pretend it was justice. You were stuck, and society had a free shot. For women, it was worse. Always worse. Locked in the stocks, they were subjected to jeers, gropes, sometimes worse. If your punishment lasted overnight, you prayed for morning, not for release, but for witnesses. And yet, the stocks were considered mild, a lesser punishment, because you didn't lose a limb, you didn't get burned, you didn't die, just your dignity did. But that's exactly why they were used so often. Easy to set up, cheap, no maintenance, no executioner required, just wood and an audience. And maybe that's the real horror. It wasn't the punishment itself, it was how casual it became, how ordinary. How many towns had stocks as permanent fixtures, like a bench or a well, just part of the scenery? A wooden structure waiting for the next unlucky soul to be locked in like a piece of broken furniture. And when your sentence was up, you weren't escorted home. You were released and left to walk away, filthy, bruised, humiliated, and never quite clean again. But if you think this was the bottom of the barrel, if you think it can't get worse than being a living punchline, then prepare yourself. Because next comes the punishment that made even the crowd squirm. A metal vise, a device of pure pressure, and when it closed, it crushed more than just bones. It crushed identity, crushed hope, crushed the human skull like fruit in a press. The head crusher. No sharp edges, no flames, no need for rats or crowds. The head crusher was pure geometry, a device of alignment, of angles, of slow, unrelenting pressure. It started with 2 iron plates sewn beneath the chin, one pressing down from above, connected by a screw, or a series of them. The victim's head was locked between them. No movement, no wiggle room. Just cold, unforgiving metal, cradling the most fragile and vital part of the body, the face. Then came the turn. The executioner, or sometimes the interrogator, because this wasn't always about killing, would start cranking the handle, slowly, deliberately. Each rotation lowered the top plate, millimeter by millimeter. Pressure built, The jaw compressed, the teeth shattered, the facial bones caved inward, eyes bulged, ears ruptured. And it didn't happen all at once. That's the point. This wasn't a guillotine, it was process. At first, it just hurt. But then, the structure of the skull began to collapse. The sinuses exploded. The sockets crushed the eyeballs. The brain, if the pressure continued, would eventually compress like a wet sponge under a brick. Death wasn't instant. It was a slow, upward bloom of agony. But here's the part that's hard to wrap your head around, pun not intended. The head crusher wasn't always used to kill. Sometimes it was simply for motivation, to get a confession, to encourage cooperation. The victim wouldn't always be cranked to completion. They'd just be brought to the brink. Imagine being told, "You can stop this, just talk," and your jaw is already broken. Your tongue is pressed against shards of your own teeth. Your vision's red with pain. And still, you might not be able to speak. You might confess just to make the handle stop turning. But the damage would linger. Survivors rare, as they were left the device with disfigured faces, jaws that never aligned again, nerve damage, lifelong pain. The head crusher didn't erase people. It marked them. Branded them with the shape of their own silence. It wasn't flashy. There were no theatrical flourishes, no cheering crowd, no flaming spectacle. Just a victim, a crank, and a face slowly becoming unrecognizable. Its simplicity made it all the more terrifying. The device itself wasn't large. It didn't need a dungeon. You could carry one under your arm, bring it into a cell, or a castle room, or anywhere justice or revenge needed a bit of extra persuasion. In fact, that's what made it so popular. It was portable tyranny, torture on demand, small enough to hide, strong enough to destroy. The head crusher wasn't about making a scene. It was about making someone disappear from within, crushing identity, crushing resistance, and leaving behind a human-shaped reminder of what happens when you say the wrong thing or nothing at all. And maybe worst of all, it didn't require guilt, just accusation. Because in medieval Europe, suspicion was a sentence, and the head crusher was just the period at the end. But the next punishment? That wasn't about pressure, or shame, or public spectacle. It was about heat, fire, and iron forged into a new kind of horror. A statue, a prison, a furnace. The Iron Maiden is next. And trust me, it's not what heavy metal made it out to be. The Iron Maiden. Let's get one thing straight. The Iron Maiden is the most famous torture device that probably never actually existed in its classic form, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying. Because whether or not medieval torturers actually used it, the idea alone was enough to make people shudder, and that tells you everything you need to know about the medieval imagination. The concept is simple. A tall iron sarcophagus, man-shaped, hinged like a door. The inside, lined with spikes. Not long ones, just sharp enough to puncture. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Positioned to avoid instant death. Instead, they pierced soft tissue. The eyes, the shoulders, the stomach, the thighs, the arms, the skin around the spine. You didn't die immediately in an Iron Maiden. That was the whole point. The door slammed shut. And then, nothing. No more movement, no light, no sound except your own heartbeat. Every shift of your weight, every twitch of a muscle pushed another spike deeper. You bled out slowly. You suffocated. Or you just sat there, trapped in an iron coffin, praying for it to end. That's the mythology. The reality? Well, historians now believe that the Iron Maiden was likely a 19th century invention, a dark, theatrical reinterpretation of medieval punishment, cooked up in museums or curiosity shows. The most famous example was found in Nuremberg in the 1800s, but there's zero solid evidence it was ever used in actual torture. And yet people believed it. People feared it. Because the psychology of the Iron Maiden is perfect. It's not just death, it's claustrophobic death. It's a horror story you can tell in one sentence. They locked him in a box full of spikes. You don't need to show it, you just need to describe it. The imagination fills in the rest. That's what makes it powerful. That's what makes it medieval even if it wasn't. Because that was the essence of medieval justice. The performance of power, the image of consequence. The idea that somewhere, in some dark room, there was a box waiting just for you. And honestly, it fits. It fits the medieval mind that brought us the rack, the wheel, the bridle, and all those other instruments of meticulously engineered suffering. Of course, they would dream up a device that doesn't just kill, it contains. A punishment that turns the body into its own prison. An execution that doubles as a burial. There's even something symbolic about it. The Iron Maiden was shaped like a woman, often stylized with a face, sometimes with flowing robes, almost saintly, which makes it all the more disturbing. You weren't just being punished, you were being embraced by pain, like being hugged by death, swallowed by steel. And isn't that just so medieval? A culture so saturated with saints and martyrdom that it turned its torture devices into twisted icons. A device that's equal parts relic and rumor, museum piece and myth. We don't know if anyone ever died in one, but we know people feared it, and that's what mattered. Because fear was the goal. The Iron Maiden doesn't need to be real to be effective. Like the best ghost stories, it gets in your head. It lingers. It dares you to imagine being inside, just for a second. Just long enough to feel the spike behind your eye. And if a torture device can make you flinch just by existing in your imagination, then it's done its job. But next we leave behind the metal. Because some punishments didn't require any devices at all. Just rope, a post, and a good sturdy fire. We're heading into the punishment that turned fear into smoke. That scorched its way into history books and nightmares. Burning at the stake is next, and it's exactly as brutal as it sounds. Burning at the stake. There's no misinterpretation here, no misunderstood mechanism, no later era myth-making. Burning at the stake was exactly what it sounds like. They tied you to a pole and set you on fire. This was medieval Europe's most iconic death sentence, equal parts execution, public ritual, and warning flare to the soul of society. And it wasn't rare. Heretics, witches, rebels, unfaithful spouses, blasphemers. If your crime touched the church or the state in the wrong place, the fire was waiting. Let's walk through it. First, the post. Sometimes just a log. Sometimes an ornate structure at the center of a plaza. The condemned would be led through the crowd, past the gawkers, past the weeping, past the cold stares of people grateful to not be in your place this time. You were bound at the waist, ankles, chest. Maybe your hands were tied behind you, maybe not. Some executions were merciful. In their own horrifying way, they'd hang a bag of gunpowder around your neck to speed things up. Others, not so lucky. Then came the faggots. No, not that it's the old term for bundles of firewood. Stacked high, packed tight, laid in a circle around your feet, your knees, up to your waist. This wasn't a campfire. This was a furnace built for one. The lighting was often ceremonial. A priest said a prayer. An official read your crimes. Maybe a crowd recited a psalm. And then flame. It started small, a puff, a flicker, and then the smoke, the kind that fills your lungs before the pain even starts. Your first instinct is to scream, but the air's already gone. And then the heat, rising, crawling, reaching your skin before you feel it. Because what you feel first is your brain telling you, this is it, this is your death, not by sword, not by blade, but by fire. Inch by inch, nerve by nerve. Clothes catch first, then hair, then flesh. But the real horror is the time. It could take 15 minutes, sometimes 30, sometimes longer. If the fire was too wet or the wind too stubborn, you didn't die fast, you died thoroughly. As your body tried to shrink from the heat, ropes held you tight. There was no falling, no collapsing, just burning, slowly, publicly. And the crowd watched. Some were solemn, some cried, others cheered. Children held their parents' hands. Vendors sold snacks. Because executions weren't just punishments. They were community events. And the message was as clear as the smoke rising into the sky. This is what happens when you challenge the order. The church used it for heretics, people who dared read the Bible in their own language, who questioned transubstantiation, who asked too many questions. The state used it for treason, for sedition, for sorcery. And witches? Oh, witches were prime candidates. The medieval world feared female power almost as much as it feared the devil. So when suspicion bloomed, whether it was midwifery, herbalism, or just a little too much independence, the flames were ready. But here's the worst part. Sometimes they burned corpses, people who had already died in prison. They exhumed the bodies and set them alight in posthumous execution, because the fire wasn't just about killing, it was about erasing. Burning at the stake wasn't just punishment, it was purification. The body turned to ash, the soul sent skyward either to hell or heaven, depending on the sermon. And sometimes, it wasn't even the final punishment. The ashes, they'd be scattered, or buried in unconsecrated ground, denied rest, denied memory. Because fire doesn't leave a body behind. And that's what medieval justice loved most. Obliteration with flair, justice that looked like a ritual, death that looked like theater. But now let's leave the fire. Because our next punishment goes in a colder direction. Not death by heat, not even death by impact. The next horror is slow, sharp, and vertical. Impaling. And once it started, there was no coming back down. Impaling. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't a figure of speech. Impaling, in the rawest, most literal form, was exactly what you think it is, forcing a human body onto a sharpened stake, from bottom to top, from earth to air, from the world of the living to something else entirely. Let's break it down. The stake was tall, taller than you, often smooth not for mercy, but for effectiveness. A rough stake might puncture too violently, cause death too quickly. A smoother one? It allowed the body to slide. The victim was stripped, sometimes tied, sometimes just lifted. The point of the stake was placed usually at the base of the spine, the perineum, or, in more brutal variations, directly through the rectum or vagina. Then gravity took over. No hammer, no force, just weight, your own weight. The body would sink slowly, inches at a time. The stake would part muscle, rupture organs, navigate the spine. If angled carefully, it could miss the heart entirely, miss the lungs, miss everything vital, which meant you stayed alive. You could last for hours, sometimes longer. Imagine that, perched on a spike like a grotesque scarecrow, your body twitching, your mind still fully awake, aware of the agony, the humiliation, the inevitability. You were no longer human. You were a monument. And people watched. This wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda, especially in Eastern Europe, where impalement became synonymous with one name in particular, Vlad III of Wallachia. You know him as Vlad the Impaler. Or maybe Dracula, but forget the fangs. The real horror was much worse. Vlad made a career of impalement, used it as military strategy, as domestic policy, as pure, uncut fear. He impaled enemies, thieves, diplomats, entire invading armies, forests of bodies, lining the roads into his cities, swaying in the wind, staked from tailbone to teeth. One account tells of 20,000 Turks impaled outside the city of Targovi, T-sight so horrifying that an enemy army turned around without even engaging. That's what impalement did. It broke more than bodies. It broke morale. But it wasn't unique to Vlad. The Byzantines used it. So did the Ottomans. So did medieval Germans and Slavs and even the French on rare occasions. Impalement was global because it worked. It was impossible to ignore. Impossible to forget. And that was the point. There was no coming back from impalement, no martyrdom, no redemption, just a slow, humiliating slide into death, elevated above the crowd like a flag of despair. The spike didn't care who you were, man or woman, old or young, innocent or guilty. It treated everyone the same like meat. It didn't just punish, it transformed, turned flesh into horror, blood into warning. And when it was over, there were no last rites, no burial. The body stayed on the stake, days, weeks, until the vultures picked it clean, until the wood rotted and the bones clattered to the ground. Because impalement wasn't just death, it was erasure by spectacle. But if you think this is where it ends, this elevation of suffering, this slow-motion horror, think again. Because not all punishments needed you to die. Some just needed you to remember. Next comes the scavenger's daughter, a device designed to do the opposite of the rack. Not to stretch you out, but to fold you in. The scavenger's daughter. If the rack was made to pull you apart, the scavenger's daughter was built to crush you in like closing a book around your spine. Invented during the brutal reign of Henry VIII, this lesser-known contraption was the sadistic sibling of the more famous rack. While the rack stretched limbs until they snapped like green branches, the scavenger's daughter went the other way. It compressed. It folded. It inverted the human frame until the body collapsed inward like a collapsing tent. Let's set the scene. A prisoner, usually someone accused of treason, espionage, or some creative betrayal, was brought to the Tower of London. There, they met the device. It looked simple. A single iron frame, hinged at the center. At first glance, it resembled a large metal bow or even a pair of stiff iron tongs. But once you were inside it, there was nothing simple about it. The victim's head was forced down between the knees. The arms were folded back behind the legs. The frame then pressed all parts together: shoulders crushed against thighs, knees driven up into the chest, back bent into a grotesque arc. Then the screw tightened. The iron closed, and the body began to compress. This wasn't just discomfort. It was systemic collapse. Muscles pushed against organs, organs crushed against bones. Veins pinched, eyes bulged, nose bled. Blood didn't just trickle, it exploded. Through the ears, through the pores, through any place pressure could find a crack. Some prisoners passed out within minutes. Some vomited. Some convulsed. All of them bled. It wasn't about survival. It was about submission. A method to extract information. To force a confession. The tighter the iron grip, the quicker the truth came spilling out: truth, lies, whatever made it stop. And unlike the rack, the scavenger's daughter didn't make a scene. No torn limbs, no cracking joints. Just a slow implosion, like watching a person disappear inside themselves. It was neat, controlled, surgical. That's what made it terrifying. It didn't take a crowd to operate. Just one jailer, a quiet room, a crank, and a little time. The pain did all the talking. Even the name was ironic. Scavenger's daughter wasn't named for bones or vulture sit, was a corruption of Skevington's daughter, after Sir Leonard Skevington, the Tower's lieutenant. The euphemistic title gave the device a strange civility, like calling a guillotine the Duchess. But there was nothing civilized about it. The damage was deep, internal, often invisible. Survivors left the device intact, but never whole. Lungs collapsed, ribs fractured, spines twisted, and the psychological scars ran even deeper. You didn't forget what it felt like to be folded in half like wet laundry crushed by an empire's authority. Yet despite its cruelty, the scavenger's daughter never achieved the same infamy as other punishments. Maybe because it wasn't public. Maybe because it didn't kill. Maybe because the victims weren't martyrs, they were names buried in the margins of royal suspicion. But the fear of it lingered. Whispers in dungeons, threats between interrogations. Keep talking, and we'll bring out her. The daughter, the fold, the last embrace you'd ever want. It was a punishment designed for silence, and that silence still echoes. But now we shift again. Not back to devices, not back to fire or steel. The next punishment is raw, immediate, almost primal. It didn't need an iron maiden or a wheeled frame, just a strong arm and a sharp blade. Because next we look at flaying, where the skin was the sentence, and survival was the cruelest part. Flaying. There are punishments you can walk away from. There are those that kill you quickly. And then there's flaying, the one that peels you out of your own body like fruit from a rind. It was one of the oldest and most excruciating punishments in the medieval catalog, and also one of the simplest in concept. Remove the skin from a living person, all of it, piece by piece, inch by screaming inch. No iron machinery, no elaborate setup, just a knife, a steady hand, and a man reduced to raw meat. The victim, usually someone accused of treason, rebellion, or the kind of offense that had to be answered with more than death, was bound, arms outstretched, legs secured, and the executioner began his work. The blade would start at the extremities, fingers, toes, then up the limbs. Or sometimes it began at the face, to get the audience's attention right away. The point was pain, yes, but also spectacle. There were records of crowds gathered to watch this, to learn from it. And they didn't have to wait long, because flaying wasn't a clean act. It didn't glide, it stuck. Skin clings to flesh like bark to a tree, and tearing it away left muscles exposed, nerves screaming, blood pouring in sheets. And yet, the executioner was trained not to go too deep. The goal wasn't to kill, at least, not right away. It was to prolong. You see, skin isn't just a surface. It's armor. It's temperature control. It's your body's biggest organ. Take it away, and your whole system begins to collapse. The pain isn't sharp, it's everywhere. Your body becomes a living wound. The air burns. The sun burns. Your own sweat burns. Victims often went into shock, but shock didn't come fast enough to be merciful. Death might take hours, sometimes longer. And if the flaying was partial, if just the back was peeled off, or just the face, you might survive. But you'd wish you didn't. There are stories from Persia, from the Ottoman Empire, from England and France. Men flayed alive in public squares. Their skin hung like banners beside them. In medieval London, the Sheriff William de Morisco was flayed and then quartered, his skin nailed to the door of Westminster Hall as a warning, as a decoration, as policy. Because that's what this was. A message. Not just to the victim, but to everyone watching. You don't betray the crown. You don't blaspheme. You don't question the natural order. Flaying wasn't about justice. It was about permanence. Death fades, bones rot, but the story of flaying sticks. You feel it in your spine, just hearing the word. And that's exactly why it was used. Because no one forgets the image of a man standing with no skin, of a face peeled back like wet paper, of hands raw and red, reaching for a mercy that never came. Sometimes, the skin was preserved, tanned, hung in churches or government buildings, a literal human warning sign. The medieval world had no qualms about turning a man's body into a legal document. And the irony? Flaying wasn't always fatal. With modern medicine, people can survive it, which only makes its use in the past more horrifying. Because it wasn't designed to kill, it was designed to destroy. And if you think this is the darkest the Middle Ages could get, if you think tearing a man out of his own flesh was the ultimate in cruelty, then brace yourself. Because the next punishment doesn't just target the body, it targets the soul. A punishment where the fire isn't beneath your feet, but inside your very blood. Next, we descend into boiling. Not metaphor, not exaggeration. Boiled alive, and somehow legal. Boiling alive. This was not symbolic. No trial by metaphor, no spiritual fire, no poetic license. Just a vat, a cauldron, a man, and heat that climbed until the blood in his veins began to simmer. Boiling alive, yes, literally, was one of medieval Europe's more gruesome executions. And disturbingly, it wasn't a fringe punishment, it was sanctioned, legal. Carried out in town squares under royal decree. When it was done, it wasn't done in secret, it was an event. Let's start with the setup. A large pot, often iron. Think stew size, except instead of turnips and beef it was human flesh. Sometimes it was filled with water. Sometimes oil, pitch, wax, tallow. Anything with a high boiling point and a low regard for human dignity. The pot was mounted on a platform, rigged with fire underneath. A scaffold was built so the crowd could get a good look. Then came the condemned. Usually, this wasn't used for just any crime. Boiling was reserved for particular cases. Poisons, assassins. Crimes considered treacherous zones that struck fear, not just outrage. In England, a statute under Henry VIII actually legalized boiling for poisoners. The logic? Poison was a hidden, cowardly murder. So the response had to be the opposite. Loud, messy, unforgettable. And it worked. The condemned was often shackled, lowered slowly into the pot feet first. No sudden drop, no make it quick. The heat was raised gradually, which meant the water didn't scorch all at once. It simmered. That's the horror. Because your nerves don't shut off at 100 degrees. They light up. They scream. Your skin doesn't slough off, immediately tightens, then blisters, then bursts. The outer layer peels back like a boiled fruit, revealing tissue that sizzles, bubbles, and blackens. Eyes melt, ears cook, lungs seize, and if the water is thick, say, oil or pitch, it clings. The pain doesn't drip off. It sticks. It coats. It becomes part of you. And yet, death doesn't come fast. Victim screamed, twitched, tried to rise, but the bindings held them in place. The heat worked slowly, systematically. 1 degree at a time, it unwound the body like string. Some accounts say the process could take 30 minutes, others over an hour. But what made boiling uniquely horrifying wasn't just the pain, it was the visibility. It was theatrical. A man in a pot screaming like a kettle, and the crowd, they watched, they learned, they told the story, and that was the whole point. Because this wasn't just justice, it was a show. A deterrent cooked in real time. You want to poison someone? This is what happens. And unlike hanging or decapitation, which offered some possibility of dignity, boiling was pure, messy deconstruction. No bones to bury, just a soup of regrets. It wasn't just England, either. France used it. So did the Holy Roman Empire. And in parts of the Middle East and Asia, boiling was even more refined sometimes, using metal bowls placed over fires with the condemned inside, cooked like human stir-fry. One Mongol method involved tying the victim down and pouring molten metal into the mouth or ears. Same principle, no escape, no second chances. And yet, despite its sheer horror, boiling never became the go-to punishment. Why? Because even by medieval standards, it was too much, too long, too disturbing. It left a smell in the air, a taste in the wind. Even the most hardened crowds had their limits. Eventually, it fell out of favor, replaced by cleaner deaths, quicker ends. But the idea stuck. Boiling became the stuff of legends, of whispered threats, the kind of punishment you mention when you really want someone to know they've crossed the line. And now, having passed through the fire, the iron, the blade, the rat, and the stake, what's left? Only the most ironic punishment of all. A device so absurd, so humiliating, that it almost feels like a joke. Almost. Next, the drunkard's cloak. Because sometimes, shame could be worse than pain. The drunkard's cloak. Not every punishment in medieval Europe was made of blood and fire. Some were built out of irony, absurdity, shame. The kind of punishment that didn't leave scars on the body but bruised the ego so hard, it never quite healed. Enter the drunkard's cloak. At first glance, it looks almost harmless. A wooden barrel, hollowed out, a few holes carved in the sides. Harmless, right? But this wasn't a prop. This was your prison, your outfit, your humiliation. Let's break it down. You get caught drunk in public. Loud, disorderly, maybe urinating in the street, maybe insulting a town official. Not exactly treason, but disruptive, annoying, embarrassing for the community. So they sentence you not to the stocks, not to the lash, but to the cloak. The barrel is placed over your torso, arms through the holes, head sticking out the top, the staves scratch your skin. The thing is heavy, restrictive, smells like old ale and damp rot. And once you're inside it, you're not alone. You're paraded. Through town, through the marketplace, down every street. People stare, children laugh, vendors heckle, dogs bark, friends pretend not to recognize you. You're the show now. A walking joke, a living meme, centuries before the internet. And it worked. Because the punishment wasn't pain, it was visibility. You became a symbol, a warning, a walking message. This is what happens when you lose control. Your body wasn't destroyed. Your pride was. And it didn't just end after the parade. You might be left to stand in a square for hours, still wearing the cloak. Sweating, swearing, itching. Unable to sit, unable to escape. And if the cloak got wet from rain, heavier. If the sun beat down on it, hotter. If a dog decided to urinate on you, just another day in the barrel. There are illustrations of this punishment from 17th century England, but its origins stretch further back. Medieval Germany used it. So did parts of Scandinavia. Even in Eastern Europe, records describe similar punishments for drunkards, gluttons, or general fools. Sometimes, they painted slogans on the barrels: town fool, public swine, king of the drunkards. Think of it as a one-man parade float of humiliation. And here's the genius, if you can call it that, of the drunkard's cloak. It required no injuries, no executioner, just a barrel, a man, and an audience. And it stuck in people's minds. Because you could recover from a beating, you could hide a scar. But once the town saw you waddling around like a walking keg of shame, that never went away. And for all its silliness, the cloak had teeth. Many who endured it didn't just suffer embarrassment. They lost jobs, status, respect. And in a tight-knit medieval village where everyone knew everyone, that was a kind of social death. Which brings us to a bigger point. Not all punishment was about blood. Sometimes it was about belonging, or rather, losing it. being turned into a walking lesson, a town's own cautionary tale brought to life in oak and humiliation. And maybe that's the most medieval thing of all. But now we leave behind the barrels, the shame, the laughing crowds. Because what comes next is quiet, dark, and final. A punishment done not to the body, but with it. Next up, gibbeting, where justice didn't end at death. It began after. The gibbet. Some punishments kill the body, some destroy the soul. And then there's the gibbeta punishment that begins after you're dead, when your body becomes the message. When your corpse is transformed into a warning sign that never stops screaming. The gibbet was, in theory, simple, but in execution, no pun intended, it was grotesquely brilliant. It started with an iron cage, man-shaped, sometimes made custom to fit your exact frame, sometimes just a basic frame with shackles. After your execution, usually hanging, you weren't buried. You weren't mourned. You were caged. Your corpse was stuffed into the gibbet and hoisted high into the air, where you swayed like a broken marionette over crossroads, ports, or city gates. And there you stayed. For days, for weeks, for years. The body didn't decay in secret. It rotted in the open. Birds pecked out the eyes. The wind whistled through ribs. The sun turned skin into parchment. Maggots had free real estate. And everyone who passed by saw the same thing. Don't make the same mistake he did. Gibbeting wasn't for your average thief. It was for spectacle. For traitors, pirates, murderers, highwaymen, anyone the state needed to make an example of. It was slow, not because of pain, but because of persistence. A punishment with no expiration date. England made it infamous. After the 1752 Murder Act, gibbeting became mandatory for certain crimes. Execution wasn't enough. The law demanded posthumous punishment. Even in death, your dignity could be stripped away. But the roots went back much further medieval and beyond. The gibbet was a billboard of vengeance, a bone and metal megaphone shouting, "This is what happens to enemies of order." And the worst part? It worked. Gibbets weren't hidden away in cemeteries or courts. They were placed where everyone had to see them, near docks, on cliffs, in town centers. The body swinging in the breeze, rotting through summer heat, freezing in winter snow, slowly shrinking down to skeleton. Children grew up walking past it every day. Merchants sold goods in its shadow. Travelers whispered prayers under its creaking frame. Sailors saw the remains of pirates hanging over harbor walls, greeted not by welcome flags, but by a grinning, skeletal captain still stuck in his final uniform. Sometimes, gibbets were reused. New bodies, same frame, a kind of recycling bin for traitors. Other times, the cages were built around the living victim, who was left to die in place. Rare, but real. Imagine that, being caged alive. No food, no water, just time, the wind, and the knowledge that you'd become your own tombstone. But even in death, it didn't end. Relatives weren't allowed to bury the body. No final rites, no closure. The remains could hang for decades. Bones rattling in the breeze, clothing shredded to ribbons. And the name? Forgotten by law, remembered only by fear. Because the gibbet didn't just punish one person. It haunted entire communities. It made the law visible and unforgettable. Eventually, it faded out. Even 18th century England found it too macabre, too unsanitary, too medieval. But for centuries, it stood as the ultimate full stop to a criminal life. Not just death, display. But if you thought that was the limitive, you thought we were done turning bodies into statements, hold on. Because the next punishment wasn't just post-mortem. It was anatomical, surgical. Next comes quartering, where the body becomes a battlefield and the sentence is written in limbs. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. When medieval Europe wanted to make a statement, an indelible, blood-soaked, bone-splitting statement, it didn't settle for hanging. It didn't settle for stabbing. It went all in. One man, one sentence, 4 directions. The full horror? It was called being hanged, drawn, and quartered. A punishment so extreme, so theatrical, it was usually reserved for the worst of the worst, traitors to the crown. Enemies of the state, men whose crimes were considered not just illegal but existential threats to the divine order. Let's walk through the process, step by savage step. First, the hanging, but not to death. The condemned was paraded to the site of execution, often on a wooden sledge, dragged by a horse, a grim public commute. People lined the streets. They knew what was coming, and so did he. At the gallows, the noose was fitted. The man was lifted just enough to choke, not enough to break the neck. The goal wasn't death. The goal was suffering. Twitching, gasping, blacking out, coming back, over and over. Then, cut down, still alive, barely. Second, the drawing, not the artistic kind. This was the euphemism for disembowelment. The condemned was laid on a table or block, his clothing stripped, his abdomen sliced open, and his entrailous intestines, his organs were pulled out. While he was still conscious, sometimes they were burned right there, in front of him. The heart was removed last, as if the executioner was trying to extract the soul 1 bloody inch at a time. The audience? Loud, but not always cheering. Even hardened spectators could only flinch so many times. Third, the quartering. Now came the anatomical finale. The body, what was left of it, was divided, traditionally into 4 parts. The head came off first, usually with an axe. The rest was butchered like livestock, arms, legs, torso, laid out. Sometimes boiled to preserve them, then shipped across the realm. The head, mounted on a spike above the city gate. The limbs, sent to distant towns, nailed to bridges, displayed in marketplaces. Each piece was a warning. This is what treason earns you. This is what happens to those who forget who rules. This wasn't justice. This was orchestration. A murder turned into a royal proclamation, an execution that doubled as political theater. And England was its stage. This punishment became infamous during the Plantagenet and Tudor reigns. William Wallace, the real one, not the Mel Gibson version, was one of its most legendary victims. Executed in 1305, his head ended up on London Bridge. His limbs scattered across the kingdom. Later, even Catholics caught in the backlash of the Reformation faced it. Jesuit priests, rebel nobles, anyone who dared suggest that God's loyalty didn't belong exclusively to the English crown. It wasn't about guilt. It was about example. Because to be hanged, drawn, and quartered was to be unmade. You weren't just killed. You were disassembled, broken down like an enemy machine, dismembered, displayed, and deleted from the social body. And it worked. People feared it, whispered about it, used it as the yardstick of horror. Other punishments had pain. This had narrative. It told a story from the first gasp on the rope to the final thud of a severed head landing in a basket. Eventually, it faded into legend. The punishment was officially abolished in the 19th century, but its specter still hangs in the air, in books, in films, in nightmares. Because some things can't be forgotten. Some things were never meant to be. And speaking of what was forgotten, what was hidden in the margins of medieval punishment, let's turn to the tools of shame. Not the wheel, not the sword, not the fire, but the mask. Next, humiliation in iron. The grotesque, grinning face of the medieval scold. The shame masks. Not every punishment drew blood, Not every sentence needed chains. Sometimes, all it took was a face, a metal one, grinning, grotesque. A caricature welded from contempt and imagination made, to be worn and remembered. They were called shame masks, also known as masks of infamy, or just the face of punishment. Forged from iron, they came in many shapes, but always with the same goal, to humiliate. And medieval Europe knew how to humiliate with flair. Picture this: a woman accused of gossiping, a man caught cheating at cards, a petty thief, or a chronic drunk, or just someone too loud in the wrong place. Nothing lethal, nothing grand. Just a minor social offense, the kind of thing that got you whispered about, not hanged. But instead of the stocks, you got the mask. An iron contraption locked over your head. Heavy, hot in summer, freezing in winter. Some masks were plain, most weren't. Some had long pig snouts, others had donkey ears, giant tongues, demonic grins, built not to punish, but to mock. The mask became a mirror distorted and cruel of your alleged sin. Caught lying? You got a forked tongue. Caught gossiping? Maybe a mask with giant ears and lips. A drunkard? A flushed, bulbous nose, drooling mouth, and eyes permanently wide in mock inebriation. Some masks had bells attached, jingling with every step, drawing attention like a parade float from hell. But this wasn't a parade. This was a walk of shame. The condemned was paraded through town, sometimes forced to perform chores or stand in the square while the crowd laughed. Kids jeered. Friends looked away. The mask didn't hurt your body. It erased your reputation. And that was the point. The iron didn't need spikes. It only needed weight. Physical, yes, but also social. You didn't bleed. You just stopped being seen as human. You became the mask, the sin, the joke. And make no mistake, this was punishment, not theater. The masks could weigh several pounds. They made breathing difficult, eating impossible. Some were designed to chafe the skin. Others had mouthpieces or gags to prevent talking. Iron bit into flesh, skin blistered under the sun. Infection set in if worn too long. And the damage didn't end when the mask came off. Because shame lingered. It followed you. People remembered what you looked like, how you looked in that mask. Your name became a punchline, a warning, a footnote in someone else's gossip. This punishment wasn't always officially documented. It was often left to local councils. Towns had their own masks, their own customs. There were hundreds of variations, scattered across Germany, Austria, Italy, France, the Low Countries. And it wasn't just for women. Sure, many shame masks targeted scolds and nagging wives, but men wore them too. Cheats, fools, liars, even students in monastic schools, if they talked too much in class. One particularly cruel variant, the flute of shame. A metal flute clamped around the fingers and neck of a bad musician. The joke? You looked like you were playing, but you couldn't move, couldn't speak. Just be seen. Because that's what shame masks did. They didn't stop the crime. They didn't heal society. They displayed failure. They made a person's worst moment visible, repeatable, unforgettable. And in that way, they were as brutal as any rack or spike. Because in the medieval world, your place in society was everything. To lose face literally was to lose status, to become the story people whispered about, to become the mask. And if you think that's as psychologically cruel as punishment could get, if you think we've reached the bottom of the emotional abyss, just wait. Because the next punishment didn't just break your body or mock your voice. It went for the knees. Literally. Next, the knee splitter, where mercy met steel, and joints went to die. The knee splitter. Some punishments were about silence, some about spectacle, and then there were those that were purely, unapologetically anatomical. brutality distilled into design. A punishment engineered for one thing and one thing only: destruction of the joint. Meet the knee splitter. It didn't pretend to be symbolic. It didn't masquerade as rehabilitation. It was exactly what it said. It was a device that took knees and split them. Let's talk design. 2 vertical bars, often studded with jagged metal spikes, sometimes as many as 20. A crank mechanism pulled the bars together like a vise. Between them, the victim's knee. Not both, just one. It only took one to get the message across. Once the leg was positioned, the executioner interrogator began to twist the screw, slowly, with care. This wasn't about instant obliteration, it was about control. With each turn, the bars inched closer, the spikes dug deeper, muscle shredded, tendons popped, ligaments, those delicate ropes that hold the leg together, tore like wet parchment. And then crunch. Bone. The patellothy kneecap cracked like ceramic. The joint was shattered, not cut, not punctured, crushed, reduced to a pulp of bone fragments, blood, and agony. And they didn't always stop there. Sometimes the knee splitter was used multiple times, on both legs, sometimes on elbows too. The idea wasn't to kill, it was to render the victim useless, permanently maimed, unwalkable, unworkable. A public symbol of punishment with every limping step. Victims might survive, might even heal sort of, but they'd never run again, never kneel in a church, never climb stairs without remembering the sound their body made when justice clamped down on it. And that was the point. The knee splitter wasn't an execution tool, it was a disabler, often used during interrogations or pre-execution punishments. A warm-up act before something worse. Or sometimes the final act for someone whose death would be inconvenient. It made sure the victim couldn't escape, couldn't fight back, couldn't live normally ever again. And in a medieval world where physical labor was life, where walking to market or tilling a field meant survival, that made it more than cruel, it made it economic sabotage. You were punished into poverty. It was used across Europe, Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, often quietly, no big stage, no scaffold, just a dungeon, a crank, and a scream. And here's what's really chilling. This wasn't about overkill. It was about precision. The knee splitter was efficient, small, easy to carry, easy to hide. You didn't need a whole torture chamber to ruin someone's life. Just this one tool. Just one leg. And while it wasn't as theatrical as the wheel or as infamous as the Iron Maiden, it was feared because everyone had knees. Everyone knew what it meant to have them taken away. In a single turn, you went from man to burden, from worker to wretch. And you didn't even get the release of death. The punishment lived on in your walk, your scars, your silence. But now, let's pivot to a different kind of silence. Not the stillness of broken limbs, but the enforced quiet of the mouth. Because if you think crushing a knee was medieval, wait until you meet the tool that ripped out tongues. Next, the tongue tearer, where speech ends with a scream. The tongue tearer. Words are power. In medieval Europe, they could start wars, sway kings, curse saints, or crack open heresies. So when someone's words became too dangerous, too loud, too heretical, too mocking, the punishment came not with a warning, but with a tool. The tongue tearer was exactly what it claimed to be, a metal clamp designed to rip the tongue straight out of a human mouth. No metaphor, no subtlety, just silence by steel. Let's talk mechanics. The device looked almost like a set of tongs, small, precise, wickedly functional. At the ends, claw-like pincers, serrated, designed to grip flesh slick with blood and saliva. It wasn't about slicing, it was about yanking. The process began with restraint, the victim's arms tied back, The jaw pried open sometimes with a wooden wedge, sometimes with brute force. Screaming made it worse. The more the tongue moved, the harder it was to get a clean grip. And then clamp. The pincers locked onto the tongue, deep toward the root, not the tip. That would be too merciful. The further back the grip, the more permanent the silence. Then came the pull. Sharp, brutal, immediate. Veins snapped, muscles tore, blood flooded the mouth, poured down the throat. The victim thrashed, choked, convulsed. In seconds, the very muscle that had spoken, sung, prayed, shouted was gone, thrown to the ground like garbage. Sometimes it was nailed to a post, as proof, as a warning. Sometimes it was just discarded. The punishment wasn't about the tongue. It was about what had been said with it. This wasn't used on criminals who stole bread. It was for blasphemers, slanderers, heretics, traitors, people whose speech was considered corrosive, dangerous, inconvenient. It wasn't just punishment. It was censorship by mutilation. You didn't get to defend yourself. You didn't get to explain. Your trial was your sentence, and the sentence was silence. And if you think this was surgical, clean, clinical, think again. No antiseptic, no anesthesia, no stitches, just a metal clamp, and a man's will to yank. The mouth became a cave of agony. The victim often choked on their own blood. If they survived, infection followed, or starvation, or suicide. Because life without a tongue in the medieval world wasn't just painful, it was impossible. No talking, no eating solid food, no bargaining, begging, praying, singing, pleading. Just slurred sounds and a mouthful of scars. You were reduced to presence only, a body without a voice. And that's what made it effective. The tongue-tierer didn't kill. It erased. It turned orators into mutes, accusers into droolers, prophets into gargling shadows. There are records from Italy, France, Spain. It was a rare punishment, but not unheard of, especially in ecclesiastical courts, where blasphemy wasn't just a crimate, was a cosmic insult. Sometimes, the sentence wasn't even tearing, just branding the tongue, or piercing it, or removing half, always enough to ruin speech, never enough to forget. Because when the state wanted control, and the church wanted obedience, the mouth was enemy territory, and the tongue-tierer was their siege weapon. But as dark as this device was, it had a strange counterpart. Because while the tongue-tierer punished too many words, the next punishment punished not enough work. Next up, the iron collar, where simply standing still could feel like a lifetime of pain. The iron collar. There were no spikes, no blades, no blood spilled. But make no mistake, the iron collar was medieval suffering in its most patient, persistent form. A punishment not of violence, but of duration. Not of mutilation, but of immobilization. And somehow, that made it worse. The device was brutally simple, a solid band of iron, forged to encircle the neck. Some versions were hinged and locked with a clasp. Others were riveted, shut-sealed until the sentence was served, or until the wearer died. The collar didn't cut, it didn't crush, but it held. Held your head in place, held your posture frozen, held your life on a leash of constant discomfort. You couldn't rest your chin, couldn't turn your neck fully. Sleeping was a nightmare. Eating was awkward. Every movement, every breath, every moment reminded you that your body now belonged to the collar. And the collar belonged to the law. This wasn't a tool of execution. It was a long-term sentence, a mobile prison. You might wear it for days, weeks, or even months. In some cases, years. Prisoners, slaves, debtors, runaway serfs, anyone. The system wanted to punish without killing, might find themselves collared. Some collars were plain, others not so much. In France and Germany, certain iron collars were designed with spikes turned inward, not long enough to impale a butt, sharp enough to punish movement. Imagine coughing with metal needles pressing into your throat. Imagine tripping. Imagine simply falling asleep and jolting awake. Pain. On a loop. Other collars had chains attached, anchoring the wearer to a wall or post. You couldn't leave, couldn't lie down, couldn't walk more than a few feet. Your whole world became a circle. Your head became a symbol of your guilt. There are surviving collars inscribed with messages: thief, liar, heretic, labels stamped in steel, branding the wearer's identity even after the sentence was complete. Some were used as public display. The condemned, chained up outside churches or city gates, wearing their shame like a medal of dishonor. Rain, cold, hunger, no comfort, no escape. The collar didn't need to strike fear, it made you wear it. And when the collar came off, if it came off, the scars didn't leave. Some suffered permanent neck damage, compressed vertebrae, collapsed posture, nerve damage, chronic pain. Others suffered psychologically, the sense of being owned, restrained, named. Because that's what the collar really was, a wearable verdict. Not a punishment that ended with the day, but one that moved with you, a reminder you carried, a cage that followed. And what made it so effective? It was quiet. No screaming, no executions. Just a man walking down a road with iron on his neck and shame in his eyes. And yet, for all its cruelty, the iron collar was one of the most normalized punishments, used in monasteries, castles, prisons. Anywhere obedience was law and pain, didn't need to be loud. But now we move from subtle torment back into mechanical madness. Because if the collar was about compression, the next device was about stretching the truth right out of your body. Next, the rack, where justice pulled no punches and absolutely no limits. The rack. This was the godfather of medieval pain, the one you've heard about, the one whispered in every dungeon, scrawled into every history book, imagined in every cinematic scream. The rack didn't hide its intentions. It stretched them literally. The design was brutal in its clarity. A rectangular wooden frame, 4 roller stow at the top, 2 at the bottom. The victim was laid flat, wrists tied to one end, ankles to the other. Then the crank turned. That's it. That's the entire method. But the horror? That was in the details. Each turn of the crank pulled the limbs in opposite directions, slowly, deliberately. Tendons stretched to the snapping point, joints dislocated, muscles tore like damp cloth, cartilage cracked. And then came the ligaments, those invisible wires holding the human body together. They didn't snap all at once, they peeled. First the shoulders, then the hips, elbows, knees. Every joint unzipped, every nerve lit up like fire in your bones. This was not a quick punishment. That was never the point. The rack was precision torment. It didn't aim to kill, it aimed to talk. Because the rack was the favorite tool of inquisitors, royal courts, and secret councils. It was the scalpel of medieval interrogation, designed not just to extract information but to shape it. You could confess to anything on the rack. Did you steal the king's jewels? Conspire with witches? Spy for the French? With your arms pulled out of their sockets and your legs 6 inches longer than God intended, you'd admit to inventing gravity if they asked. The Spanish Inquisition used it. So did the English under Queen Elizabeth. Even the early modern courts of Europe, deep into the Renaissance, kept one tucked away, just in case the truth needed to be encouraged. And the screams? They weren't for show. They were part of the process. Each cry, each gasp, was a response to truth being twisted body and mind. Witnesses were often present. Judges, priests. They called it evidence, even when bones popped loud enough to echo off stone walls. And if you survived, you weren't the same. Victims left the rack permanently disfigured, arms useless, legs uneven, spines twisted like wet rope. Many died days later, from infection, from internal bleeding, from pain that simply wouldn't end. Others lived on, but not really, not fully. They were broken beings in every sense of the word. And yet, the rack was never officially outlawed in many places. It just faded. Not because it lost favor, but because more refined methods came into vogue. Quieter tools. Psychological weapons. But the image remained. The crank, the ropes, the scream. Because the rack was more than a device. It was a promise, a declaration, that the body could be rewritten by force, that truth could be extracted 1 inch at a time. And now, as we creak toward the end of this parade of pain, one more punishment waits in the wings. A punishment with a grin. A punishment with a throne. Next, the iron chair reborn in flame. The iron chair, heated. We've already met the iron chair in its cold form, an iron throne lined with spikes, a punishment of stillness, silence, and slow burn humiliation. But there was another version. One that took everything cruel about the original and cranked up the agony literally. The heated iron chair. This was pain perfected by temperature. The chair itself remained the same, forged from solid metal, its surface embedded with hundreds of short, sharp spikes across the seat, back, arms, and footrest. The victim was strapped in naked or nearly so that every inch of skin made contact with iron. The spikes weren't long enough to kill immediately. They were just deep enough to wound, to sting, to keep the victim present. But in this variation, the chair didn't stay cold. A fire was lit beneath. Coals, flames, bellows to feed the heat. The entire structure began to warm, then glow, then burn. And the body responded. First with sweat, then with tremors, then with the unmistakable sizzle of skin against metal. The spikes, now red hot, didn't just pierce, they cooked. They branded. They turned the victim's flesh into a map of open wounds and blackened scars. And yet the person couldn't move. Strapped in tight, every twitch, every shift, every desperate attempt to escape only drove the spikes deeper. Pressure met heat, metal met muscle, pain became infinite. This wasn't about death, it was about duration. The chair didn't kill quickly. It killed eventually, if it killed at all. Sometimes it was just used for confessions. A few minutes on the coals, then off. Enough to scar, enough to make sure you never, ever lied again. Other times, the fire was left burning. Until the chair cooled on its own, until there was nothing left in it but bone and blackened meat. The origins of the heated chair trace back through multiple European kingdoms, especially in Spain, Italy, and France, during the height of inquisitorial justice. It wasn't mass-produced, it wasn't common, but it was legendary, because it had all the elements the medieval world loved, in a punishment, public pain, symbolic justice, and a design that was both simple and horrifying. And like so many other devices of the time, it wasn't just about hurting the victim, it was about performing power. The chair looked like a throne, and that wasn't accidental. The condemned didn't sit, they were enthroned in agony, mocked by the very object that symbolized authority, stability, rule. And when it was over, when the scream stopped and the chair was scraped, the fire stayed lit, because there was always someone else waiting. Another body, another story. The chair was ready. And now, as our tour through medieval punishment nears its end, one final cruelty beckons. A punishment that twists the idea of confession into a deadly loop. One last device. The heretic's fork. 2 prongs. One truth. No forgiveness. The heretic's fork. Sometimes, the most terrifying punishments didn't involve grand displays. They didn't crack bones or spill organs. They didn't boil, burn, or bleed. Sometimes, all it took was 2 inches of cold iron and a cruel understanding of the human need to move. Enter the heretic's fork. This was a punishment of stillness, of tension, of control. The device itself was simple. A metal rod with 2 sharp prongs at each end. One set pointed upward, pressed beneath the chin. The other pointed downward, placed against the upper chest, or, in some variations, the sternum. The rod was strapped in place with a collar iron, of course locking the fork between 2 essential points of movement. Now imagine this. You can't lower your head. You can't nod. You can't even swallow too hard without the risk of a bloody jab. And if you flinch, if you twitch, if you fall asleep and your neck relaxes for even a second, the prongs dig in. Not deeply enough to kill. Not fast, but enough to pierce flesh, to draw blood, to remind you, constantly, that your body is a traitor to your survival. And that's the twisted genius of the heretic's fork. It didn't do anything. It waited. This wasn't a punishment of action. It was a punishment of anticipation, of paranoia. The victim was left standing or chained upright for hours, sometimes longer. No movement allowed. No rest. No forgiveness. Used primarily during Inquisitions, especially in Spain and Italy, the fork was a favorite for accused heretics. Those who had confessed, recanted, and were awaiting penance. Or those refusing to confess and being reminded that they still had time to reconsider. And the best part? From the torturer's perspective, the fork left almost no marks, 2 small punctures, barely visible, a polite, bloodless tool of absolute psychological horror. In some versions, the device included inscriptions, Latin phrases like, "I abjure," or "I am a liar," literal declarations of guilt hanging from the collar as the victim was paraded in front of crowds or held in place during trials. There were variations too. Some forks had a single pair of prongs sewn end, placed between the chin and chest, others between the back of the neck and shoulders, keeping the head pressed down instead of up. The common denominator? No movement, no comfort, no end. And if you fell asleep? That was the most tragic part. Fatigue always won. The body collapsed, the prongs stabbed. You woke with a jolt of pain and the knowledge that it would happen again, and again, until you broke. This punishment was often paired with fasting, with cold, with darkness, not to increase the pain but to increase the desperation. You weren't tortured into a confession, you were worn into one. And that's the essence of the heretic's fork. It didn't scream, it whispered. A quiet, metallic warning that even silence can be deadly, that even stillness can be violence, that a small piece of iron placed just right could control a mind better than any whip or flame. And when it was finally removed, the body might survive, but the instinct, the fear of moving remained. Because sometimes, the scariest part of medieval punishment wasn't the fire. It was the pause before the pain. The ducking stool. If medieval Europe had a punishment designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate in full, wet, public view, it was the ducking stool. This wasn't about spikes or fire. It wasn't about blood. It was about drowning by reputation. A wooden chair mounted on a long beam, often positioned over a pond, river, or filthy public trough. And it had one specific kind of person in its sights: scolds. Who were scolds? Mostly women, mostly poor, mostly loud. the kind of people who refused to stay silent when injustice knocked on their cottage door, wives who talked back, midwives who questioned clergy, neighbors who got too opinionated. In other words, people who made noise. So the village magistrates, in all their wisdom, ordered silence. Through submersion. Here's how it worked. The condemned woman was strapped into the chair tightly, arms and legs secured, sometimes gagged, sometimes not. Then, using a lever or a rotating beam, the chair was swung out over water and lowered. Slowly, deliberately, down she went. The first dip, cold shock, gasping, spluttering, laughter from the crowd. The second, longer, a little deeper. The air disappears, panic rises, the crowd watches. Is it still punishment or entertainment? The third, the fourth. The line between discipline and attempted murder starts to blur. The goal wasn't to kill, at least not officially, but people did drown, because this wasn't about health and safety, it was about spectacle, and more than that, it was about gender. The ducking stool wasn't just punishment, it was control, specifically of women. Medieval society had little patience for a woman who questioned her role, challenged authority, or simply refused to shut up. And rather than argue with her, they dunked her. Over and over, until her words turned to choking, until her voice turned to gasps. And even when it didn't kill, it left a mark. Sodden, shamed, humiliated. The victim was dragged out in front of her neighbors, her family, the entire community like a warning flag dripping pond water and disgrace. It didn't stop at witches either. By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern era, the ducking stool became a catch-all punishment for gossipers, prostitutes, unmarried Mother Saintly women who stepped outside her lane. But here's the irony. It was a public punishment that depended on the public's reaction. Sometimes, the crowd turned, booed the magistrates, demanded the chair be lifted, called it unjust. Because even in the cruelty of the medieval system, there were limits, and seeing a woman nearly drown in filthy river water for talking too much sometimes crossed them. Eventually, the ducking stool fell out of fashion, not because society got kinder, but because laws changed. Reputation management became more discreet. Humiliation took newer, subtler forms. But the echoes of that punishment? They're still with us. In every attempt to silence, every insult meant to shame, every system designed to cool off a voice instead of listening to it. Because the ducking stool wasn't about water. It was about power. And next, we take that power to its most absurd, theatrical, and horrifying conclusion with the brazen bull. A punishment that didn't just kill you, it amplified your screams. The brazen bull. There are medieval punishments that kill, and then there are those that consume. The brazen bull was not just an execution method, it was an acoustic monument to agony, designed not only to end a life, but to turn that death into a grotesque performance. The story begins in ancient Greece, but the device's mythos echoed well into the medieval imagination because the brazen bull was just too horrific to forget. It started with a statue, a large bronze bull, meticulously cast from metal, hollow inside, but with one crucial modification, a chamber designed to hold a human being. The victim was forced inside often naked, often screaming, the door sealed behind them, and beneath the belly of the beast, a fire was lit. The bronze began to heat, slowly, mercilessly. Inside, the air turned thin. The metal walls became an oven, skin blistered, lungs seared. Death crept upward in waves of heat, breathlessness, and claustrophobia. But the horror wasn't finished, because the brazen bull was also an instrument. Its creator's twisted geniuses really designed a series of pipes and tubes inside the bull's head, These channels transformed the victim's screams into roars, amplified, distorted, mechanical. It didn't sound like human pain anymore. It sounded like a bull in rage. Outside, spectators heard the beast bellowing. Not a man dying, a monster, a warning, a ritual. The first known user was Phalaris, a tyrant of Akragas, who supposedly tested the device on its inventor. Fitting. But while it started as an ancient atrocity, the idea found fertile ground in the Middle Ages where spectacle and punishment went hand in hand. Medieval Europe adored symbols. And what better symbol of control, judgment, and divine wrath than a golden beast that ate sinners alive and sang their death? The church may have frowned on theatrical executions, but that didn't stop whispers of the brazen bull being used in particularly cruel inquisitions, especially when a heretic needed to be turned into a legend, or when fear needed to travel. Because the bull didn't just kill you, it turned your voice into something inhuman. It deformed your final moments, it rewrote your end. And that was the real punishment. Not the fire, not the roasting, but the loss of identity, the reduction of a person into a sound, a shriek into a growl, a name into smoke. Afterwards, what remained? Ash, bone, melted metal where flesh had fused to the walls. The bull didn't give back. It kept part of you baked into its belly, forged into its roar. The device's legacy persisted not just in stories, but in philosophy. It became a symbol of ultimate tyranny, of what happens when justice becomes performance, when punishment becomes branding. And today, you can still see replicas in museums, in books, in nightmares. Because even if it was never as widely used as the rack or the wheel, the brazen bull is remembered, and that's what punishment is ultimately about, isn't it? Memory. But for our final step into the dark cathedral of medieval justice, we turn not to sound, but to cold strategy. A punishment that didn't burn or bleed, but controlled every breath. Next, the garrote, where death came quietly, and the collar never let go. The garrote. If the rack was a scream, and the brazen bull was a roar, the garrote was a whisper. No spectacle, no blood, no fire, just a chair, a collar, and a twist. A quiet killing machine for a system that sometimes wanted death without the theater. The garrote, sometimes spelled garrote, was a device of finality. No pretense of reform, no drawn-out suffering. When this thing was brought out, the sentence had already been passed. There was no need to make a point, just a need to end. Let's break it down. The basic setup: a sturdy chair or bench, with a vertical post behind the seat. At the top of the post, a metal collar, sometimes just a loop of iron, sometimes an intricate device with a screw or crank mechanism. The condemned was seated, bound. The collar was locked around the neck. Then the executioner turned the crank. One twist, maybe two. The collar tightened, the neck compressed, the larynx crushed, the vertebrae cracked, the windpipe collapsed. Sometimes the spinal cord was severed. Death could be instantaneous if the executioner was skilled, or it could take minutes, a slow choke, a strangled silence. Unlike the gallows, the garrote didn't allow for thrashing. The body stayed seated, still, controlled. Death was clean, at least on the surface. No drop, no convulsions. Just pressure and then stillness. It was used in Spain, Portugal, parts of Italy, even in the Spanish colonies. It became a standard execution method for centuries long after the medieval period officially ended. The last official use in Spain? 1974. Let that sink in. But its medieval roots run deep. The church preferred it to more brutal methods for certain crimes. Heretics, apostates. Sometimes noble stows deemed too important to hang like common criminals, but not important enough to escape punishment. It was seen as merciful, efficient, dignified. But mercy is a matter of perspective, because the garrote was also used in interrogation, in partial executions. The crank tightened just enough to cause agony, to crush the windpipe without killing, to bring a man to the edge and hold him there, long enough to get answers, or confessions, or tears. It was psychological as much as physical. The condemned sat upright, aware, the collar cold against the throat, knowing that every breath might be their last, knowing that they were one crank away from the end. And after death? The garrote left no dramatic wounds, just a broken neck, a purple tongue, a life extinguished with the efficiency of a machine built for a single, silent purpose. And that's what made it terrifying. Because unlike the wheel or the bull, the garrote didn't want to be remembered. It didn't want to be legendary. It wanted to be effective, to work every time, no audience needed. It was the bureaucrat of punishments. But in that very coldness, its lack of spectacle told a darker truth about medieval justice, that not all cruelty needs fire and steel. Sometimes, all it needs is a chair, a collar, and someone to turn the screw. And now after 30 stops through fire, iron, humiliation, and execution, we've seen it all. We've walked the racks, dangled from wheels, boiled, burned, silenced, and displayed. But through it all, one truth endures. Medieval punishment wasn't just about death. It was about memory. And now, the final question. Did they learn from it? Or just pass the torch to the next generation of pain?